You
I
and
don't get it.
you and Sam are the only ones without hats.
Well, that's because I'm in climate control comfort.
Ah,
And you don't
good.
have issues with COVID hair like I do.
I have COVID hair today. That's why I'm having my hat.
All right, Sharon, I
Okay.
think you're good to go.
Can we call this meeting to order, please? Everybody had a chance to look at the July 20th, 2020 minutes. Can I have a motion to approve?
I move to approve the minutes.
Well, that's because I'm in climate control.
Okay, so, yes, I'm taking notes now, so I have to pay attention. Okay, so Jason moved, and a second, please.
I second.
Okay. Alrighty, and any comments, corrections, notices? Ah, now everybody's here. Okay. We've got a motion and a second on the floor to accept or to approve the July 2020 minutes. Anybody, I'm asking now for comments, corrections, anything like that? Okay, let's go ahead and vote. All in favor for the approval? Oh, I guess I do a roll call. Okay, Glenn,
Yep.
Jason,
Yes.
Nicola? Is she on? I'll leave her blank. Shauna,
Yes.
Steve,
Yes.
Scott is absent, and me.
I
Yes.
can see Nicola, but I don't know if she maybe doesn't have audio.
Well, oh,
I can see that she's logged in and she can see you and hear you, but I don't know if she can. I know that we can't hear her.
huh.
So Nicola, if you can hear this, then I would say that you could call the phone number that was in the participation email, or you can maybe still keep trying.
Okay, good. All right. Let's move on to old business. I have a brief, very brief update on housing availability from two realty agencies here in Oxford, just to find out where we stand in terms of vacancies and stuff. Coldwell Banker has 12 vacancies for families and 13 vacancies for students as of last Friday. They have 450 units in total, so that's a 5.5% vacancy rate. And then this is, oh, Shauna, who is Brian affiliated with?
Brian Reveley?
Mhm.
I forget which.
Okay, I'll look
Remax.
that up. Excuse me?
It's Alpha Remax.
Alpha Remax, thank you. Okay, so they have, as of today, they have 3 vacancies in non-student rentals, 1 vacancy in student rentals. They control 55 available units. An additional 5 are being remodeled, so I'm assuming those will go on the market as soon as they're remodeled. And they have that leaves a vacancy rate of 7%. So that's just a bit of information. Okay, shall we move on to the Housing Trust Fund? Revenue sources, Shauna?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, I had more than revenue
Okay,
sources in here,
whatever
but
you.
so I mentioned this before some of the people arrived. I just kind of want clarification on what is going on with the Housing Trust Fund as far as like being a budget item. Because I know there's a lot of confusion because we just emptied it out. The city manager at first didn't like how it was going because it wasn't being filled or used. So I just was hoping Sam could like let us know exactly what's going on with that.
Sure, thanks, Shauna. The plan right now is for it just to be a zero balance until there's any revenue sources that are identified. And I think the staff is willing to do that for the 2021 budget year. preferably there would be a revenue source identified, but if there's not one, the city manager and finance director are okay with that for the time period. And that would come up in the council's approval of the budget in October as well. And if at that time there is a revenue source identified, then obviously that would be preferable. But for right now, it's just going to be a zero balance unless council wants to do something else with it.
Question, don't we have to have different enabling legislation to make it the appropriate type of account? I thought that was one of the issues.
That hasn't been identified by staff at this time, no.
As a problem, it hasn't been
Correct.
identified. Okay.
All right, if everyone's satisfied with that answer, sounds like that through 2021, we don't have to actually worry about it being something staff doesn't like. So next I was looking at funding sources. And I'm just going off the outline that I sent out. So if anyone has further information, I'm just gonna start at the top. So grants and other outside funding sources that are like grants. I was kind of thinking Steve might have some suggestions or other folks out there. So.
Well, I'm sure there are some, and it's pretty easy to do some targeted research. That's not an area where I've spent a lot of time looking, and I can also check with some of the folks that I know that are in housing related organizations. So yes, that's a possibility. And I also think that when we have our housing report done, and if it has recommendations in it, those are the kinds of things that we can approach places like the Greater Cincinnati Foundation and some other of the large organizations in the area that appreciate housing needs.
Okay.
Plus then all of the federal government things. And I think that Bud Scharf would be a terrific resource for us, who was at City of Hamilton for a long time and is now the Assistant Director of the Butler County Metro Housing Authority.
Okay, cool. So my first question is, does anyone know a specific place now during this meeting that we could reach out to? Or do we need to do research and figure that out?
What I've always found is that having a stated need, I think we all have a gut level of the need, but I don't think we've got a documentation of it yet. So I'm not sure that we've got a good sell, or, you know, in my business, a good ask.
Okay, yep.
Yeah, it's always good to have data behind what you're talking about.
And I
Cool.
also think that, you know, if we're serious about this, I think it would be advantageous for us to have some income streams already in place with the city. You know, for instance, the ones that we're going to be talking about. Even if we have just conceptually committed to those with a future start date, I think that can be, I mean, it shows skin in the game. Because I think that well, let's see, you know, like the Greater Cincinnati Foundation might throw in $100,000 once, but they would want to know that we've got a true plan for using that, and that we've got the documentation of need for how we would go about it. And they would also be concerned about sustaining the effort in some way. So if we're saying, hey guys, give us your money, we're going to spend your money, and then we don't know what we're going to do.
Right. Yeah, I wanted to get into what we're going to use it for a bit later. I mostly put the funding sources first because I know that we're going to talk about a couple of them in more detail. But I just didn't know if anybody had a specific grant provider. Yeah, Jason.
So I think in one of the previous meetings I had on homelessness locally and addressing those issues, one had been mentioned, and I have it somewhere in my notes, but I can't find it right now. But also going back to data, I know there's been some data that has suggested we are actually one of the highest homeless density locations in Butler County. But that also has a lot to do with how you measure it and all those other things, because there's certainly more homelessness in other places, but they have higher general population density to begin with. But also, I know I've heard that there's some organizations currently taking such data, but also we have stuff from the Family Resource Center that Nicola could provide empirically, even if that's not as systematically collected as maybe some of the homelessness surveys are. But at least we could say, yes, we had this many people come to use these services that were homeless or housing insecure over the last 2, 3, 4 years, whatever.
Oh, yeah, that's
Good place
good.
to start, I think.
Nicola, are you on so that you can speak?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yay, Nicola.
Hey.
So what Jason just suggested is that perhaps you could provide us with data on homelessness and folks that have needed help with housing in the last 2 to 3 years. Is that something you could provide?
Yeah, I mean, like Jason was just saying, we haven't really had a systematic way to record it in terms of like specifically for research purposes, but we definitely have a count because we keep a client tracker. And so we can go back. I mean, definitely the last year, and we'll try and go back the years before too and see what we have. I mean, just a rough estimate that we did for last year was, I think, about 75 to 80 homeless people that came through us. I'm not sure that we were able to help all of them, but definitely either came by or called to find out, looking for services. So yes, I mean, we can do a more systematic tracking and kind of look back at our data again and go through files and all of that. So, if that's something that we need to do, we can do that.
Fantastic. That's really good. Does anyone have any more to say about this type of funding?
Well, we had, and maybe that's a resource we can kind of go back to, is that this homeless crisis response program that runs out of Warren County, but it is utilized even for Butler County. And I mean, they specifically provide direct assistance for those looking for housing, for the homeless. It's a long process, and but maybe we can tap them and see what else they have in terms of just a sum of money if they do. But I know we helped about 4 or 5 clients, I think, through that program. It's a really long, drawn out process, and we felt like at that point in time it wasn't working out for us here,
Okay.
because finding the housing here was the most difficult part. And so we kind of, we spoke to them and we kind of asked them whether they could do it directly and even like look at housing in Hamilton for some of our Oxford residents. We've been talking to them again, so we can, I can find out some more details about that as well for the funding.
What was
purposes.
the name of that organization? I just missed it when you said it.
Well, the program is called Housing Crisis Response Program, HCRP.
Okay. Let me just, okay.
And we're probably going to have to sort of have 2 different buckets, because we want to do the homeless bucket, but we also want to focus on trying to get affordable housing either
Right.
built or converted in town, and that should also be part of this the trust fund.
I do think it would be
Okay.
good to make an accounting of all the possible grants that would apply. Like, we should definitely know what's available to us at the start of it, I think.
Yeah, and then, you know, when we talk about like what the uses for the housing trust fund would be, we're going to have different categories of, you know, organizations that will reach out to, like, you know, homelessness or affordable housing or whatever. So that's something we can work on in the future.
Additionally,
Any
we
other-
have got to see how the housing market shakes out, because, you know, with all the turmoil with how the Miami students are going to do and whether they're going to be going back home again, or whether they're going to, you know, Miami's going to downsize. I mean, Ohio U has pretty much gutted an awful lot of its departments. You know, Miami may be looking at doing something similar too. So we need to sort of see how things are going to settle out. And having that study delayed a bit, thank you very much, Sam, will I think will help us get more of a grasp on that. Because as the year works through, I think that Miami's going to have to be making some big decisions.
Yeah. Okay, my next item on here is a percentage of the transient guest lodging hospitality tax, which currently doesn't exist. I know that Glenn brought up in somewhere with City Council. Do you want to say more about that?
I mean, we need to start looking for funding sources, and the transient lodging tax, well, transient lodging services need to be folded into the hospitality tax. I know we've talked about that for at least a year, and with the current situation going on, this seems like a judicious move on the city's part. I just didn't know if the Housing Advisory Commission was on board with that or not. I'm like reading the room in previous meetings, it seems that everybody is, but.
Well, we actually, if you look at the minutes from 2 months ago, we did actually recommend to council. We voted to recommend to council that happen. And then I thought that you had brought that to them.
Yeah, we had a goal setting meeting, and one of the things that we were talking about was finding all available monies that we can to offset the losses that we are incurring from this year's issues.
Yeah.
Okay.
One of the things I would like to say, Shauna, is I'm not necessarily going to affect Oxford and Miami, but I know that on the East Coast, there are a lot of people now who have bought Airbnb for things that are not being used because people won't travel. So there's a lot of dumping going on the market. And have we, of the Airbnbs, have we sort of kept track as to how many there have been over the last couple of years, and whether we have an increasing market or a shrinking market?
The
I think
trend is increasing.
I'm sorry, Sam.
The trend is increasing.
Oh, good. Excellent. Okay. Well, I mean,
Well,
loss of housing is not good, but
I would also think though that a lot of the use coming in for sports events and big gathering weekends that at least this year aren't going to happen. Even if that's true though, I think, Glenn, this is definitely the time, and Jason, that council should be talking about this, because there's going to be a whole lot less pushback, because the volume isn't going to be there at this point, but hopefully would rebuild. And
Also, we might need that revenue now more than ever, as Glenn mentioned, but also because not just the city in itself, but the people that we need to help is likely going to increase because of COVID and the financial crisis following.
mhm.
To your point, Steve, the demand for Airbnb and Verbo and any transient housing, that's not going down in Oxford. Oxford has weekly college non-university events that go on mainly through the Panhellenic stuff, like the Greek stuff. So parents' weekends, siblings' weekends, littles weekends, big weekend, alumni weekend, like all these different weekends that the Greek organizations have. And they extremely quickly fill up our traditional hospitality space. So then all the Airbnbs get filled up. Then they end up going down to Hamilton. So the more Airbnbs that come online, the more they just get filled. Not only that, you have visiting assistant professors and other professors that just don't want to go back home to their regular houses, and they'll grab an Airbnb just to stay here overnight in case they're doing research or something like that. There's a lot of reasons that these things get utilized that most people just don't realize.
Just
But
call me an out of touch boomer, guys.
I mean, it is, you only know what you know. Same with me. But yeah, I just want to try. I mean, I've always wanted to get as much money as I can for the city, because if you can intake a bunch of money, then you can start using money to do other things besides like making sure that the city doesn't fall apart. Like right now, we're in make sure the city doesn't fall apart mode. But if we can get more income, then we can start providing more services like, Jason was talking about, and I am not an individual that does not want to help people in need, but I want to make absolutely sure that helping people in need is not going to be at the cost of causing portions of the city to fall apart. And the way to solve that is to make more money. And that's why I'm seeing this money just slipping through the city's fingers through all these Airbnb guys, knowing that they're providing hospitality services and not paying that tax. And it kind of,
So should we reinforce our request in a more official and updated motion to council?
I got to defer to Sam on that one. Like, he knows that council is very vested in having this happen. I'm pretty sure Sam also knows that the HAC wants it to happen. I just don't know from our end what we need to do to help that process move forward. So I'd have to defer to Sam on that.
So the finance director and I are talking frequently about how to handle these. And so I think it's a natural part of that conversation, to decide what happens, if anything, with the idea of a tax, not just the registration and the permitting and the licensing, but, if there's going to be any tax changes as well. He and I had talked over a year ago about increasing that the beds more than one anyway, less than 5 anyway. So, and we realize that there's that desire from the housing advisory. So yeah, I don't think you need to do anything further on that. November is the time of year when there are fee changes that we would ask council to consider annually anyway. And that was the time when he was planning to do that. It just so happens that Planning Commission wrapped up their review of the zoning amendments. So that would probably work out nicely for those things to come around the same time here in October and November. So I think it's just a natural sequence.
Oh, that's perfect. That's closer than I thought. Yeah, Jason.
Yeah. So do we currently have an official designation for a B&B? And if so, does that apply to the hospitality tax?
So the definition that you just reviewed at Planning Commission would be that definition. There was one in there, and it would only apply to the current hospitality tax that's in the state code if it has more than 5 beds. But if the local amendment is not made to the state code, then it would have to be a more than 5 bed B&B for the tax revenue to benefit to the city for that, assuming the owner submits it, which is part of the matter. And we actually have vendors approaching us wanting to sell their services to kind of handle all this for us, to make sure that people are essentially, it's an audit, basically. It's like Rita does for the Airbnb industry.
So what you're saying is if the amendment passed, that there might be people who are violating that in terms of number of days rented and such, but wouldn't
Right.
actually submit to become a B&B per our definition.
Right.
So it seems like the next step then would just be to have city council do this action. And sounds like, and I agree with Glenn, the city probably needs money as a whole more than housing does. I mean, it's not like we've been doing stuff like thus far. Jason, I know that I said that incorrectly. I just meant the housing trust fund. I didn't mean we wouldn't do anything for housing. But so that first step is going to happen probably October, November, and then we can go forward from there. I'm just clarifying. Yes. Okay. And then Glenn, this is kind of your thing. Penalties for vacant or non-performing properties.
You got me with my mouth full.
Sorry about that, man.
So the next step regarding trying to make as much money for the city as physically possible due to the situation that we're in. We have quite a few vacant properties that I consider to be commercial. They're priced as commercial, they're advertised as commercial. They might actually be in a single family home. To me, that's irrelevant. But we also have prime locations in our uptown district that are also non-performing. There's one right now that is being transformed, and in my eyes, I can go, we'll give those guys a pass. They're actively redeveloping it. Okay, cool with that. But we have plenty of other ones that aren't doing anything. And I know that these guys are holding out for the highest per square foot charge that they can do. But there comes a point where that kind of stuff is detrimental to the city and the city's health, because we make money off of payroll tax. And as people start getting laid off and furloughed and you know, dealing with like unemployment, people not wanting to come back because the unemployment is making them so comfortable, which is another conversation that's outside of this scope. But we need to figure out a way to incentivize performance of those properties. Now, when Alan was still here, he was talking about the business improvement district, the bid, and that was with him and Kate and a couple of other stakeholders. I think David Prithers was in there. Chamber of Commerce people were in there as well. And they made some inroads to essentially creating like a neighborhood overlay, but it was like a business neighborhood overlay. And it was my understanding that the contributions based off of that were tiered upon performance of your property. So if you're actively contributing to the city with payroll tax and your business is open and you're doing other things like that enhance the city's character, then you pay X. But if your property is not doing anything, then you pay X plus Y. But all of that goes towards enhanced trash pickup, sidewalk cleaning, universal recycling dumpsters and things like that. Like everyone wouldn't have to pay for their own individual recycling, like that, those kinds of benefits. However, I don't know where that is currently, because the individuals that were running it, besides I believe Dave being on that board, but essentially the people that are running it are no longer running it, or they're actually no longer associated with the city anymore. So I don't know if that is something that falls under the purview of the Housing Commission as it relates to a single family dwelling that happens to be a for-profit entity, or if that's going to be something that the CIC has to address because it's a business related endeavor.
Well, when I was on Redevelop Hamilton, downtown, Hamilton had a TID, but it was very, very specific to the area and the kinds of projects that you talked about. So it didn't give the city funds to help with the kinds of support projects that I heard you talking about earlier, Glenn. So although I like that as a concept, you know, it takes another board that meets with some regularity to decide the kinds of things that, I mean, and maybe some city expenses could be put off to it, such as charges for taking up and putting down the lighting, or things for special events uptown, snow removal. Anyway, you know, that has an interesting concept, but the other piece of underperforming commercial properties throughout the city, which I believe there are, I think should be addressed by a council. And, you know, I see no reason why we couldn't ask the people who were conversing about the topic before to at least come back and kind of tie it up into a package to pass on to somebody else. I'm sure that both Alan and Kate are willing to do that because of the investment that they have in us. But I don't necessarily see it as housing.
Well, the bid didn't really have anything to do with housing, even though that was mainly an uptown thing.
Yeah.
And my whole thought process regarding that was an attempt to expand it to all commercial properties.
Yeah.
Now, it's my understanding that at least in the city of Oxford, if you have a single family house, or like a single family dwelling, and you are renting it out, or you are leasing it, or doing something other than being the owner occupant, it is still not considered a commercial property. It's still considered a residential property. Now, that's the first step that I envisioned was, if you're not an owner occupant of a house in Oxford, that house now becomes a commercial property, which have different rules. And I just, that is one of the clarifications that I want to make. And I don't know if this commission agrees with something like that, because if we do that, then those properties, I'm not sure, still fall under the purview of this commission. So I don't know, like, it is all housing, regardless of if it's for profit or not, under this commission, or is it just single family dwellings? Like, I don't, like, do we have a purview over apartments? Because like an apartment is a commercial property. You can't argue that. Like, multifamily dwellings are definitely commercial property, unless you're doing something like house hacking. But I just see a lot of properties that I know, in my opinion, are commercial properties. Like, a lot of single family dwellings are commercial properties, and they're empty because they're either being Airbnb'd, they're vacant Airbnbs, or they're being they're holding out for either a sweetheart rent deal,
Yeah,
or just they're trying to sell it and not rent it, so that the income that is produced from that property goes down from the last time that they rented it, which changes the price of that property based on a commercial valuation.
well, I mean, it's my opinion that our purview is anything that provides housing. And we've certainly have talked about apartments and the availability there. We've talked about dorms on campus. You know, campus is not our responsibility, but it certainly impacts the housing issue. So I don't see why we would have any less say about what people need to live and where people live if it's been identified as a commercial property versus a solely residential one. And I really like your idea. I think we should be encouraging council to move forward on that. You know, I wish Scott were here. I think he may have a different opinion as a real estate agent, but Glenn, you know, you're an owner too.
Yeah.
And you know, here you are letting us know that you respect and like that idea. And I think all of us realize that the city needs revenue streams. And once again, this is the time to bring things forward like that. A crisis is good for making change.
Yeah, I agree with Steve. Oh, sorry, Jason. Go ahead, Jason.
No, it's okay. I was just going to say, I totally agree with the efforts, although I think we definitely need to concentrate on why things make sense. It can't be just about revenue stream, right? Even though the city's going to need that, you can't just look for sources. I think the issue is here, and same thing with hospitality, like hospitality tax right now, the lack of it for short-term rentals is basically a loophole, right? They're avoiding taxation that's already, so that's an unfair practice. In this sense, it's more of an issue of blight. And, you know, you could talk about opportunity costs, which is very real too. But in terms of a legal basis for this, it's that it's not being occupied. And there's all sorts of stuff that Glenn's mentioned at previous meetings, you know, that it draws in crime, potentially drug use, it's not kept up. So it brings down, you know, all sorts of different things. And I think that's where it's founded, even though it will definitely help with these other issues that are very important as well. It's just not the basis of it.
Well, and additionally, we need housing in Oxford. So having anything off the market means that we have people who can't find the housing that they need.
Yeah,
So
exactly. That was exactly the point I was going to make, is that of course it's our purview because it's taking these dwellings off the market.
Yeah, and that's something I talked about at last planning meeting a lot, right? It's the opportunity cost there that's lost for actual housing and not just short-term rentals. So that's definitely a big part of it. And that falls under a lot of our various decision standards around these issues.
So it's tough for me to come up with a plan of action that would be of least resistance by a property owner, because I know how they think. And I also want to respect, if somebody buys a property, that then they should be able to use it in the way that they see fit. Now, there comes a point where their expectation does not meet reality. And it's that gap that I want to say, okay, you know, you had 3 months, 6 months of this expectation that you had of your property to generate this kind of income. It's not happening. So now you need to make this thing start performing, or, you know, suffer some sort of consequence for just having it sit there. Because, you know, that was the whole point of the neighborhood overlays. They didn't want houses sitting around, or they didn't want to have a whole bunch of transient people in the neighborhood because they wanted to generate a neighborhood kind of feel. It was widely adopted. It was extremely popular.
Glenn, you answered your own question because you said that you don't want to tell people how to use their property. Their property is not being used. It is housing. It is not being used as housing if it's sitting empty.
Well, you're right, but you know, they might want to redevelop it, and they might be in the middle of some permitting processes or some other things like that. So you have to allow some time, but it's one of those things where, like, I don't know how much time is an indefensible amount of time before the city can say, you know, start doing something with this, or else we're going to make you do something with it.
Well, and permitting the city would know about. the city has a record of people coming in for permits. So if this property has sat and nobody's applied for permits for a year, then clearly they don't have any desire to do the improvements that they're talking about.
All right. Understood. Now, after having just this little bit of conversation, I think the order of operations that we should probably take, and this is, again, this is my whole opinion about this, is to the October, November timeframe, get the hospitality tax stuff going on Airbnb or just transient housing in general. Once that's in place, then that removes one of the major, I guess, defenses against what I'm talking about right now, because anyone can say, oh, well, this thing is being Airbnb and now it's in this giant legal loophole. We can't go in there and look at it. We can't really do anything other than maybe go on to Vrbo or Airbnb themselves and just see if the property shows up as far as audit is concerned. But Sam just said that we could pay some other company a fee and have them doing the auditing for us, which seems like a huge win, because I'm trying as hard as possible not to tax these guys any more than they already are. Like, I mean, they're crazy overloaded with the work that they're doing. And I'm trying to figure out elegant ways to solve some of these problems that we want to have fixed without crushing them under all these different types of things that we're asking them to do.
Right, but in addition, you're asking the city to pay for something, which negates trying to save the city some money.
Well, I disagree with that. That's an investment because that's going to generate us income. Like when we audit people and we get them all into compliance, that the bit of money that they charge us for that, is going to save a ton of time on their end. When you start looking at the money value of time, like $25 every hour of an unclassified person's time.
Right.
I'm sure that the fee that they're charging is going to be way lower than the amount of time spent that they're going to have, as well as the opportunity cost of not doing other stuff.
Great.
So like outsourcing auditing practices for these kinds of things, like I'm okay with that. Like that's an investment in the city, and I'm all about investing in the city. Getting the transient housing stuff in place, the transient housing taxing in place, first step. Then we can say, okay, let's come up with a set of regulations that say, if your house has not been utilized for anything, so like if you're not paying hospitality tax, or if you're not pulling rental permits and actively renting that, which means that, you know, the utility bills, like somebody came in and actually has some utility bills going on that house that's not in your name or your LLC's name or something like that, then, you know, there's some period of time. I don't know if it's 90 days. I don't know if it's 180 days. That's the one thing that I'm not really sure about. Semester wise is 4 months. That's 120 days. So I'm guessing 180 days would be sufficient. It's just one of those things where it's like, you have this property, you haven't done anything with it for over 6 months. Start doing, like, you have X amount of days to do something with this property, whether it's redevelop it, Airbnb the thing, or rent it out before some consequence happens. And I don't know what that is. And like Jason was saying, I would present this legislation through the prevention of blight. And I know that a homeowner is going to say, well, I take care of the property and I do this and I do that. And it's like, well, we have a lot of individuals that go door to door looking for vacant properties to break into and set up shop, whether it's selling drugs, squatting, you know, or otherwise, like stealing copper pipes out of the walls, like all this kind of stuff that we've experienced in the town. I mean, our police office does a great job in quelling that kind of stuff, but these things happen. They just don't happen when people are living in the house. You know, like people know that there's people in there, there's lights on, there's TVs running, things like that. Most of those guys stay away from that kind of stuff. They're looking for the low hanging fruit, which again plays into the blight. Like we can make the case to implement those kinds of things. But you're at least looking at January, February timeframe. If it's October, November, just to get the transient housing tax stuff in place. And if it's a tax, I don't know if we have to go back to the polls and have people vote on that, or if it's just an addendum to something that already exists that just folds in an additional type of unit. Like that's another one of those things I have to defer to Sam on.
The latter.
All right, cool. That makes life a lot easier.
It does.
So now it seems like we got like a 4-month plan regarding this kind, like those two things, you know, getting the transient stuff on board with the lodging tax or the hospitality tax. And then we can start moving towards, okay, you have a commercial property that is not being utilized or not being lived in, or a for-profit dwelling that's not being utilized. That's a blight to this city. I just don't know what the wording, like there'd be some wordsmithing that have to go on to just say, if you have a commercial property and it's not being utilized, after a certain period of time, the city considers that to be blighted. And it's just coming up with language that is legally defensible at that point. And I guess we could run that concurrently, just knowing that we're not going to be able to present it until after October, November, before we get this other stuff in place, so that the landlords don't have a loophole to hide behind, and then we can move forward with that.
My
You good
advice,
on that? Oh, go ahead, Sam. Sorry.
thanks. My advice on that is to link it to the housing study, and then because if you don't have a reason for it, that, you know, we have a strong hunch that, okay, if a property is vacant, then there's probably a desire to wait for a paying customer so that the resale value stays the same. But I think the connection you're trying to make, if I could help you just to make that next step, is that's linked to the housing cost for somebody who's unable to attain housing. Because if that purchase price lowers or the rent, the monthly rent lowers, then that opens up a whole new opportunity for renters that didn't exist before. So I think if you make that jump prior to having a housing study that shows where the needs are, then your success rate is going to be a little bit lower. So I think you're right in trying to follow that sequence. And it's a policy matter. You know, it's a truly a philosophical policy on, okay, now that we see that there's this need, which we're not quite sure what the numbers are going to look like, but once we see that, then it's okay, what is our job as a government to do? And if a tool to make the true property value float to the top, if you will, is really what you're after, then I think looking at the ways you can do that is the kind of discussion you need to have at the council level. And I also agree that you're right to be cautious about protecting people's property rights, that, okay, they've invested in this property and it's their right to do what they want to with it. But when it starts to have effects on either the neighborhood or the ability for people that want to live in the community to be able to afford to live there, then you need to bring those things out. So I think, yes, even if it is a single family home, it's a house. You know, it's a dwelling unit. So it's within and even if you look at the purpose statements that you discussed over the past several weeks, you know, your task is, as you've kind of said for yourself, is to help the people that are struggling. And so if this has a cascading effect to them eventually, then I think you can make that case that it's within your purpose.
So Sam, having not seen the questionnaire that we're doing the survey, do you have a specific question on there for homeowners, for property owners about why their property, why they would let property sit vacant, or something that you actually are going to have data, specific data to report?
Not on the why, just if it is and if it has been.
Okay.
Nobody's going to tell you what the why is. And it's they're trying to maximize their profit.
No, well, they wouldn't tell you, but there's a way to word it so that you can make it as a general question. Actually, Sam, in some of those examples that you guys showed me, there was a way to word it so that it was a general question that you could actually be answering if you'd seen other people doing it, or you're familiar with the idea that gets
Okay.
you the data that you need.
Okay.
Hey, Sam, regarding the housing study timing, that's going to fall after October, November, correct?
No, I don't think so. They're supposed to deliver a draft to us the first week of October. So yeah, I mean, I think that's gonna, and the fee discussion is typically in November. And although a transient tax is not a fee, it is something that I think it would make sense for it to go into effect at the start of a calendar year. So I think the finance director's perspective was, let's just do it all at the same time. If that's something council wants to do, discuss it at the same time as the fee ordinance. So yeah, we should have the housing study prior to the fee ordinance and tax discussion.
So now, based off of that information, should we be more aggressive in developing language the moment that we get that housing study back? If we're going to start discussing fee structures that may go into effect at the beginning of the calendar year, that way there may be fees that get assessed to people after their property languishes for X amount of time.
My question would be, would the city administration want to have more time to digest the report before we go making changes in the city rules and regulations?
I think our biggest concern is enforcing something as unusual as a vacancy tax is what we're calling it internally. You know, figuring out how to do that. It's just not traditional local government. So I'm not saying we're unwilling, but to your point, Sherry, I just don't know how. And I think, Glenn, you're sensitive to, okay, what are the triggers? What is the timeframes? So I don't want to keep kicking the can, Sherry, but I also don't know how.
Right.
So if we can see that a majority of council, you know, wants to make this happen, then yeah, we'll do our best to figure it out. And maybe it might take, you know, having some outside help to do it. But like I said in the transient guest tax collection auditor, and I don't think I actually said this, but I was getting to it. The revenue does outweigh the cost of the service. So, you know, maybe there is, maybe it is a better than a net zero, you know, project.
Well, I would also guess that since affordable housing has been such a huge issue for the past couple of years, that there is somebody doing something relatively similar somewhere in the United States of America. So we could probably do some research and probably find some city or town that has, you know, that is progressive, I guess you want to talk progressive enough to go ahead and do. I mean, San Francisco would be the first thing I would think of, that they might have something that would do. Glenn is wrinkling his nose.
Yeah, actually, that's why I raised my hand. I was about to say, like, basically what Sherry said is, I wonder, especially in college towns where this whole, you know, leaving something open, waiting on someone to actually pay that rent exorbitant fee. Like, I don't know if that exists anywhere else. Like, if you guys have had that opportunity and all the other things that you've been doing to check on that.
Madison, Wisconsin, Burlington, Vermont.
Well, no, I meant that actually has those kinds of policies.
I think there is one, and it's Austin, Texas.
That doesn't surprise me.
I mean, a
Okay.
lot of times I think it's going to be tricky because there's so much demand and so little supply in some of the cities we're talking about that it would never make financial sense. There's many situations like ours where it seems like limited supply, sufficient demand, but there's also tax incentives in certain ways that makes it profitable to just sit on a property and not do anything with it, despite there being willing businesses or residents, depending on what kind of property we're talking about, that would like to use it.
Does anyone have anything else to say on this specific detail, this like item? No? All right. The last thing I had, so I am seeing that it's already 2:30. I'd like to like say this last item, which I think will go quickly. And then I have possible uses for the Housing Trust Fund. I'd like to actually table that part of the conversation to maybe the next meeting so that we can definitely talk about the TGL legislation that we looked at in planning, as well as the updates that Sam has. Is everyone cool with that? All right. So the other thing I had on here was in lieu fees for incentives instead of actually providing affordable housing units. I know we've talked about how the staff doesn't exactly have time to start working on this incentive stuff, but just wanted to put that out there as that cash payment being a possibility to go into the Housing Trust Fund. Yeah, go ahead, Steve.
Well, just that I think recent history has shown us that most of the things that are coming to us are developments of student housing. And therefore, it seems to me to be judicious to be trying to have a reason to have conversations with those that are developing something larger for temporary or possibly all year use, to have to assist us in some of these other things. But I think we have to be most sensitive to if we have a staffing capacity to carry it off first.
Do you have?
I would
go ahead.
I would also like to say, I don't want to present what we're talking about right now as only affordable housing. I would prefer to present it as mixed use housing. So I just don't want to limit it to what people call affordable, because affordable is sort of a social construct word. So you're looking at low income housing. When you talk about affordable housing, that's what most people talk about. But I think if you have low income housing, senior housing, or intergenerational housing, like you said, year round units instead of this semester housing, because that's actually a housing type here in Oxford, which is weird. Is that, people actually have like a monthly year round rate with like actual year leases and 2-year leases that aren't semester based, and they don't have to pay everything up front. It's like a month to month contract. That's an actual type of housing here, because most of this, the student housing is you pay up front for the semester and then you pay up front for the next semester, but you have to reserve your house 2 years in advance for a 2-year lease. Like that's your traditional contract currently. That's strictly a supply demand issue. But when I talk about mixed use housing, there's low income housing, intergenerational housing, contract housing. I'll just call it contract housing, like the month to month lease type housing. And those are the 3 things that can actually get people in the town that actually want to stay in town. And you just got to figure out how to present that instead of just affordable. So when we start talking about incentive programs, those would be like the 3 things that I'd want to present to a developer and then try to use, what was the apartment complex that was on Arrowhead that's now the Verge? What was that
Various
called?
things. Yeah, I mean, there was Pinehurst, there was like
Miami Village.
Miami
Miami
Village.
Village, yeah.
So that would be my example of mixed use housing for a student development, because that was basically a student development, but it had efficiency units in it, and it had, like I guess like Alan used to say, workforce housing. And I don't know why they did that way. Maybe it was for people that maintain the premises and that they just got a place to stay there. But until the Verge got a hold of it and completely redeveloped it, there were a lot of people, both students and the residents that lived there that weren't students, that were very happy with those living arrangements.
Oh, yes.
and
Yeah.
and that just disappeared. And because we didn't have those controls, not controls, but incentives in place, the Verge became the Verge, and those people got displaced. So like now it's one of those deals where if we can find another municipality that has something similar already in place, and then we can just adjust that model, that would be cool. Unfortunately, I know I don't have the time to do that, but that's just, yeah.
So this isn't like weird. This is done all over. And I have sample code, like Dave Prithurch back like 2 years ago when we had the subcommittee on this. I mean, this all exists. So, that code exists. We can definitely put it into place. Now, as far as it being, instead of just like low income housing, it being senior housing or intergenerational housing, I mean, that would be obviously amazing. I just think it definitely needs to happen though, because developments are,
Yeah, they're not gonna
the
stop.
Western Knolls development is about to happen and we don't have this policy in place. Now, I know the RFP asks for there to be affordable housing in there and mixed use housing as you're describing it. But it's too bad that this policy isn't already in place so that we could get some more promises or money or whatever. But
So I got another question for Sam. In the negotiations with a developer regarding a PUD, can you essentially negotiate what we're trying to codify in the future? So like PUD comes out, there's give and take and things like that there. Could you say, sure, we'll give you this, but we need you to either make a unit be intergenerational senior housing, contract housing, or pay into this trust fund X amount of dollars?
Yes, I think you can, but we would prefer to do it as part of the sales agreement rather than in the planning commission and council review, because the
Okay.
sales agreement would come before it would go to planning commission and city council.
But you guys could still handle that, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we would do that internally before we brought it to council to agree to dispose of the property based on a certain price. And the reason for that is because as the property owner, we hold the leverage to get that. If we're not the property owner, it's going to be a whole lot harder to get in the middle of the buyer and the seller until there's such legislation that you're talking about.
So in the case of at least the Western Knolls, could we use that as the trial run?
Sure.
To say like, hey, we want X percentage of this to be mixed use housing, or pay us X amount of dollars.
You can. It'll depend on how the responses go.
Okay.
We've got 15 or 20 people that have registered to download the plans, and we're hoping that 3 or 4 of those will submit proposals. And if a couple of them have experience in mixed use housing and housing of different markets, then I think we'll have that leverage. If not, we won't have that leverage and we'll have to use the code for future projects.
Right,
Or you, as a council, you might decide, nope, we're not going to sell it.
right.
So
So,
Right.
Sam, to have it in the sales agreement, I know that there have been some developments since in the time that I've been in Oxford where things were specified and yet when the project was finished, they had not done what they had been asked to do. Do you guys have any teeth to enforce anything, or?
the only one I know of like that was Hawks Landing. And I believe that was due to there not being a written agreement. There was discussion with the city manager at the time and the developer, but then it did not make it into a council agenda in the form of a resolution. So there was just a hope and a prayer without any follow through. I'm not aware of other ones that had to do with housing affordability or requirements of developers that were above and beyond what the code had, what I would call a true development agreement. So was there another one?
The only thing I can think of is the one that's being developed near the golf course. I know that when he initially wanted to start developing here in Oxford, he was going to do affordable housing, but I don't think that's what's going in. Is that correct?
No, it's definitely not what's going in. Those are 400,000+ houses. So, which is well above what our last report showed was what the market was short on, at least on the lower end of the spectrum. But that there was not a requirement in the legislation, kind of as Shauna was alluding to. You know, so if something is not codified, or if the owner doesn't agree to a condition based on whatever the requirement is, which there wasn't one, then no, there wouldn't have been any reason to for the city to come back on anyone because it wasn't a requirement.
But his plans never included affordable housing to begin with.
There was a little bit of discussion, I think originally for something in the mid 200s, upper 200s, and then it just kind of kept going up from there as the project moved forward, whether it was due to materials or labor or land, I'm not sure what. I know there was some current concerns from the developer about the infrastructure installation costs too, underground utilities costs requirements the city has, which is a whole separate discussion. And then the developer of South Farm also talked about price as part of their proposal, the 25 lots off of Kerr Road. So neither one of those projects, the city had any kind of leverage to require a certain price point.
All right. The only other item I had on here was question marks. So if anybody has any other ideas about funding sources, I don't know that we need to try to tease that out like right this second, but if you do think of anything in addition to what we've talked about, you know, please let me add it to a list somewhere. Oh, go ahead. Yeah, Steve.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just thinking about underperforming university properties, such as their former IT building out on Booth Road, that I'd be interested in acquiring for the senior center. But in Hamilton, one of the things that made the downtown district go was the fact that government properties did agree to contribute to that fund. And so I think that becomes another side issue for us to have in the back of our minds, that the university is a member of the community and has underperforming properties, commercial properties.
And Jason.
Sorry, I was just going to go back that before that, I think the thing you started talking about was, is everybody sort of in agreement that in lieu fees in the situation in which we want mixed housing, that would go towards the trust fund, right? But we never really did answer that, even though I think we're all in agreement on it.
Do you want me to take a roll call vote, Jason? Do you think it's necessary?
I didn't think we needed a vote. I just know that we started out with that question and we went off in a whole bunch of different directions that were good, but weren't exactly addressing the question. So I thought we just all agree, like, that's what we want to do, right? And everybody's shaking their head, so I think we're good.
Yes. Okay.
Yes,
Oh, is that okay with you?
yes.
All right. Well, then the section I had for possible uses, let's talk about that some other time. And then Sam had some updates and new business.
We haven't finished old business, Honey Bunch.
Oh, well, he had updates, old business updates.
Well, I had a suggestion that perhaps we want to move the three or two of the three or some proportion thereof of the remaining old business items to the next meeting. Does anybody have a burning desire to talk about any of either the homeless shelter, the Western Knolls, or the cottage community today? Speak up.
Nope. And I have a meeting at 3, so.
So, all right, so let's move all three of these to the next meeting.
Thank you.
And then we can move, we probably need to take a vote on that. Can I have a motion, please?
I would
Hello.
move that we table the homeless shelter, Western Knolls and cottage community discussions in old business until our next meeting.
Seconded.
And Glenn, that was you?
I seconded.
Okay, moving on to new business topics. Do we still have stuff left for the transient guest lodging to discuss? We've sort of beaten that horse, yes? Okay, so people, do I have a motion for adjournment?
Wait, I thought Sam actually had new business to talk about the legislation. Am I wrong about that?
It's not on here. Sam, do you have something new?
Oh, it was on the agenda.
No, it's not.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I could
Okay.
say that it's on the council agenda for the first meeting in September, which will be the 1st. So for first reading, for the zoning text amendment only.
I assume everybody knows what these people are talking about?
Yeah, I was just looking at the agenda under new business topics, transient guest lodging, recent planning action.
So the planning commission made a recommendation to city council.
Oh, is that all you were gonna say? Okay.
Was-
I'm just gonna add one really quick comment to it is just that I do think that this has a lot to do with housing, obviously. And I really liked, I'm just reporting as a planning commission member, that some of the details, I know Jason has some ideas too, I know he has a meeting at 3, but I personally, and I'm happy to talk to anyone about this like offline, I find the numbers that were created for this legislation like a threshold for whether something turns into a bed and breakfast and needs, an additional conditional use hearing with planning commission. Like personally, I think it does it balances the need for affordable housing in town with allowing people to do this kind of business. So that's just my opinion that I'm putting forward from being at planning.
Do we have to worry about any kind of offline discussion, Sam?
Prior to the council vote, it's probably not the best idea if it's, as long as it's not a quorum, it's okay. But if you do have those offline conversations at the next meeting, you'll want to report that and say, hey, so-and-so and I had a conversation about this, and this is what we discussed. That way, if somebody does see you at the library or in town talking about it, then, you've kind of aired that out in the public, and especially since council hasn't voted on it yet. That's just to play it safe.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Okay, and now, do I have a motion to adjourn the meeting?
So move.
Second?
Seconded.
Okay, Jason. Roll call. Jason,
Yes.
Shauna,
Yes.
Glenn,
No. Yeah.
okay,
Rebel.
okay. Let's see, Nicola,
Yes.
Steve,
Yes.
and me. I got everybody, right?
Yes.
Yeah, good, good. Want to make sure. Okay. All righty. So, thank you all for participating. We got lots to move on next time, and hopefully other things to talk about. I think this was a great discussion. Thank you very much, Glenn, for bringing up something new that we can all do research on. And okay, take care, everybody. Stay safe.
Bye.
Right.
Bye, thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you.